If you hate playing against a knight and wanted to quit chess because of it, I can relate too. I've been there for a very long time, and I've been practicing with knight puzzles with almost no success, still getting my knight trapped. But today, I'm going to share with you how I managed to successfully climb to over 2000 elo with these 10 anti-knight tips here. And by the end of the video, you might be able to deal with those tricky knights in a better way. So tip number 1 is to limit hanging pieces. So take a look in this position. Black has 2 rooks and a queen, but there's a big problem here because they're uncoordinated or unprotected or hanging here. And the knights are incredibly good at making 2 threats at a time, forcing the king to move, and the move can come with a tempo. And your opponent will just have to waste a turn defending the loose piece. And if you got a loose piece just hanging around and undefended, that is a recipe for disaster. And here's just another position. Let's say you accidentally fell for a fork here. So white in this position will definitely try to take a rook because that's the whole point of the tactic. And after they take a rook, you capture back with the queen or with the bishop. But even though you're down material, you're down the exchange in this position, you at least mitigated the damage. And that's very important because you didn't completely lose yet. So basically, support and coordination is the key. Whether you do that with the pieces or with the pawn, make sure you support your pieces so that if you do manage to blunder a fork, then at least you can capture back. Tip number 2, avoid making positional holes. And what I mean by this is, let's say in this position, white just played the move b4. But there's a big problem with this move because it creates this hole, and this hole is like Swiss cheese hole, and you don't want to create holes in your position. Your enemies could clamp down on the square with their pawns, and also in the future, they can just enter with the knight, which gives them a huge positional advantage because that knight can't be kicked out by a pawn. And so what you have to do then is you might have to defend that square with a knight, so you're going to play defensively instead of playing more proactively. And so because of this, now the learning lesson here is you don't want to push your pawns recklessly. And if they do manage to make a hole because you forgot, then you have to trade the knights. This is a very important tip number 3, pieces on opposite colors. Stay away from the dark squares in this position. Your king is in check and your rook is on a dark square. And all you have to do is just light on a light square and you'll never get forked. And if your rook is far away from the king, it doesn't really matter as much. But also, another helpful tip is that you can place your king or piece 2 diagonals away, and the knight can't fork you for at least 2 to 3 turns. And this tip is really great and helpful a lot of times, but you can't really rely on it all the time because your opponent, so here, the black queen is on a dark square and the king is on a light square. And your opponents can use advanced tactics like attraction, luring the king into the same colored square, and then you're going to get forked. And after the fork, the king moves, and after the queen is taken, you're just lost. So the learning lesson here is be mindful of pieces on the same color. So if there's a king or a queen or pieces, then you want to be mindful of squares. And generally, if you're 2 diagonals away from the knight with one of your pieces, you don't have to worry about that piece for 2 to 3 turns generally. Tip number 4, extra careful when near king. Let me show you a game where my opponent just won my queen, but I took advantage of the powerful knights around the king. And this is really tricky for my opponent. So here, I had a plan to win the game with my knights. The first, I take the h7 pawn, and here, my opponent could take the knight, but they decided to just step aside because there's some discoveries with the bishop on d3. Now, I recapture back with the rook, and black offers a trade. I go back with the knight, and I'm threatening to actually win the dark square bishop, because if the queen recaptures, then I can just fork the queen and the king here. So Black decides to defend the f7 square with the queen and develop the knight, but I just take the bishop anyways because of that same tactic. He wasn't actually defending it. Now black does the very smart thing and just trades the rooks and then decides to defend the f7 pawn with the rook. At this point, I have to go back, and here my opponent really asks me the question, do I want to still stay tricky with the knights? Well, the answer is yes. So I go in with the knights, targeting the f7 pawn, and now my opponent plays king g7, a normal looking move to try to make me decide, am I going to go back and trade it and just be in a worse position? Or are they just going to take my knight for free? But little did they know that I would just take the pawn anyways, because if they take with the rook, there's a fork and I equalize the game. So they move back with the queen, and according to Stockfish, this is an even equal position. And so this is the absolute psychological torture you can do to your opponent when the knights are near your opponent's king. And the biggest tip I have against this is that whenever the knights are near your king, just trade them, and you won't have to deal with all the complexity. Or if you're more confident in defending, you can do that as well. Tip number 5. Defend outposts around your king. In this position, white has a knight on f5. This is a typical square where it can add a lot of pressure on the knight, and you might have to trade your light score bishop for the knight here. Here, in this position, black also has a very scary outpost on f4. And f4 controls a lot of squares around the king, and this could be very scary because it can't be kicked by a pawn in this position. So here, white decides to play the move rook to d1, which protects that square, but they neglected the fact that now I could just add more pressure onto f3 and e2 with my knight. And here, my opponent was low on time, and they played the move bishop to g2. And they completely missed my move. They spent 7 seconds on that move, and here they missed the move knight to e2. And after they resigned, and they resigned because after the knight recaptures, there's the fork. I'm gonna win their queen, and then I'm gonna win their game. So with outposts around the king, you have to first you have to really protect the weak squares around your king. And also, you have to anticipate your opponent's critical knight moves and play defensively against it. Tip number 6. Complicate with your knights. So in this position, black has a lot of pressure with their knights, dominant knights on the 4th rank here, and my knights are more passive, more defensive. And they obviously are intending to play knight to d3 to add more pressure on the f2 square, which they're going to try to go for a checkmate attack. So the first tip I have is just try to trade some of the pieces there. So not only are you reducing the complexity of the position, but also you're reducing the attackers and giving yourself more chances to survive. And the opponent played knight to d3, and now they're attacking the rook and attacking the f2 pawn here. So I have to move the rook, of course, and defend the pawn. Now they put a triple pressure on the f2 pawn, and there's not much I can do at this point. So I try to go defend it once more with my rook. Now after the knight trade, I can't recapture back with the pawn because the rook on f8 will be hanging. So I capture back with the rook, and now they just capture the f2 pawn with their knight. And here I have to just protect that rook, and it looks like I'm completely losing, and I am. And after the move queen to f4, attacking my rook, this looks like a completely losing position, but they missed the resource queen to e1, which will protect the rook, attack the knight, and now the knight is hanging, and they just lose a whole knight. So in this position, this is the biggest tip here, is that you have to never resign because you want to make things very tricky for your opponents. Make them prove that they can win the game. And you can also set traps in the position that your opponents will never expect, especially in low time trouble. Tip number 7, dominate with the bishop. You might have seen the bishop dominate the knight on the rim just like this, but I want to discuss the position where the knight is actually pretty strong, covering important squares. I don't want to trade my dark square bishop and weaken my dark squares. But watch how I control the game. And first I play the move bishop to e4, so I block the queen's access, the e-file. And now we have the move knight to d7. And this move is possible now because I moved my light square bishop, and it targets my dark square bishop. But my opponent misses that I can just take the pawn on d4 and protect the f6 square. And that attacks not only the queen, but also the f2 square. Now, after queen to f4, I still have to be careful with the bishop because that's covering the f6 square, which can be very dangerous. But my move first comes with check. After check, king h2, and it looks like black doesn't have any attack anymore because this bishop is actually blocking the attack from the rook and the queen. So that's why here I decided to sacrifice the bishop. Bishop to g1 check. I sacrifice a whole bishop, and if white takes, it's checkmate. So they just decide to go back to h1, and now it looks like I don't have any useful checks anymore. So I just go back to d4, and that is, I still cover the f6 square, so the knight can't jump in and the queen can't jump in. I'm still safe. And this is how you can dominate the knight with the bishop. Just play on both sides of the board. But because the bishop is a long-range piece, it can attack and defend at the same time. And you can also just casually cover the knight's potential jumps with your bishop as well. Tip number 8. Space plus pawn structure is equal to a bad knight. Now, this is a position where white has played the move rook g5. And if you look at the pawn structure, it's incredibly difficult for the black knight to move because all the squares that the knight wants to jump to is actually covered by either its own pawns or my pawns, or there's also the rook on g8, but the knight's not going to go backwards. But in this case, my opponent decided to play knight to c8, trying to reroute, but even if they go to d6, you can see that it's still covered by a lot of my pawns as well. So I just play a move like f4, and f4, I could have played a lot of moves, but I just played just a slow move just to see what my opponent would do. Now we have the move knight to b6, attacking my a4 pawn. I push it, and the knight can go back, but my opponent plays the move knight to a4. And here, the knight is trapped after the move b3. And b3, it looks like, how am I trapping the knight? Because I'm only attacking with the pawn. Well, the bishop complements and rook covers the important squares, the escape squares that the knight wants to go to. And also, we have this b6 square, this square right here, that will be covered by the pawn as well. So to make your opponent's knight useless, just make sure to cover the key squares with your pawns and have your pieces just complement the squares that your pawns can't reach. Tip number 9, watch out for the queen and knight synergy. When you're calculating, you should pay attention to the queen and knight combo because it's very tricky. They're most likely going to end up on the same color and control squares. Like for example, in this position, the queen is controlling the light squares and the knight is controlling the dark squares. And that's trapping the black queen in this position. And Vishy Anand demonstrates a similar concept here, where right now his queen is on b4 and the knight is on c5, both on dark squares. We have knight to a6 to start off this sequence, a beautiful move sacrificing the knight, but clearing the way for this queen checkmate. Black has to defend by taking the bishop, queen f8 check, king d7, and now we have knight c5 checkmate. And if you notice anything about this position, that the queen is guarding the dark squares and the knight is covering the light squares because they're on the same colored pieces. This is how a lot of the variations you should calculate should involve if your opponent has knights and queens against you. So in closed or open positions, just watch out for the same colored knight and queen attacks to simplify your calculations in complicated positions. Tip number 10, the best offense is equal to the best defense. And what I mean by this is that you can force your opponent's knight to be passive with your amazing attack. In this position, the knight on e6 has to stay there, playing a very passive role because it has to defend the queen maneuver, which will checkmate black if they're not careful. This is a really powerful technique that you need to know. But you can't just rely on this technique only. And Emanuel Lasker with the white pieces shows exactly that. He first faces to move this bishop queen battery that will checkmate white onto g2 if they're not careful. And Emanuel Lasker plays the move queen a7, attacking the a4 pawn, threatening to infiltrate. After a3, we have queen to b8 check, king h7, king h2, and this was the last chance that black had to play the move queen to d7, which will get rid of the bishop queen battery, but it saves their game. But instead, they played king to g6 because of time trouble, and now this allowed Emanuel Lasker to infiltrate onto h8, threatening to play the queen takes h5 after white plays the move g4. And so to stop this threat, black played the move h4, saying that if you play g4 now, there's en passant. But this was too late for black because they didn't realize the next move that Emanuel Lasker had, which was bishop to h6, sacrificing a bishop here. And now we have the move bishop to f6, knight to h4 check. Now the knight is able to get out of its defensive position and go sacrifice itself for an attack here. Now queen b, and now after the queen g7 check, this is simply just a beautiful mate on the board. Now congratulations, you learned 10 anti-knight tricks. If you like this video, please like and subscribe.